Well, my Skyfall video seems to have gotten some interest, and some people in the comments had asked me what my thoughts on Spectre were. Having recently watched the movie for the first time since theaters, it seems now's as good a time as any to make a video about it. I don't think I need to point out that Spectre is a flawed movie, as many fans and critics have already done a pretty thorough job of describing the movie's weaknesses. Although I will say that some of the things that bothered me in theaters didn't have the same effect the second time around. Maybe it's because I knew what to expect. But anyway, what I want to do in this video is not to focus on the flaws, which I think are pretty obvious and well known, but to instead talk about some of the cool ideas in this movie that maybe get overshadowed among all the criticism. One thing that seems clear by now is that the Bond producers have been chasing a certain degree of prestige since the release of Casino Royale. First by hiring Mark Forster to direct Quantum of Solace, then by hiring Sam Mendes for Skyfall and Spectre. But whereas Forster's particular brand of prestige centered on being topical and edgy, Mendes seems more focused on bringing real thematic substance to the series. That much is apparent from just about any interview you can find with him. For example, in this interview he mentions how Skyfall was about mothers, with Silva and Bond fighting over the common mother figure of M, and so one of the goals was to make Spectre about fathers, Dr. Swan's father Mr. White, and Bond's foster father, who was Blofeld's real father. This gives some additional context to what many consider to be a confusing choice of making Bond and his arch-nemesis foster brothers. But really, this is just a part of a much larger conceptual tapestry that Mendes and the screenwriters were able to create. And whereas Skyfall slowly clued us into its thematic ambitions, Spectre lets us know what it's about right off the bat. Before I get into all that though, I need to go into a bit of history. You see, one other thing that's shaped the Craig era has been the legal ownership of various parts of the Bond franchise. As I mentioned in the Skyfall video, MGM didn't acquire the film rights to Casino Royale until 1999. Those rights were previously owned by Columbia Pictures, who produced their own adaptation in the 60s as a parody of MGM's Bond films. So, MGM now had the rights, but there was another problem. The plot of Casino Royale basically doesn't work unless there's a larger organization behind Le Chiffre. In the book, that organization was SMERSH, a Soviet intelligence agency. But in the previous MGM Bond films, SMERSH had always been replaced with Spectre, a different, fictitious organization from the novels, headed famously by Ernst Stavro Blofeld. However, MGM lost the rights to both the Spectre organization and the Blofeld character in the same lawsuit that led to the creation of Never Say Never Again. So, they couldn't use Spectre, and SMERSH is obviously out as the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. And we all know what happens next. The organization wasn't named until Quantum of Solace, where it was given the name Quantum, but it's basically just Spectre with a different name. Flash forward to 2013, after the release of Skyfall, when MGM finally reacquired the rights to Spectre and Blofeld as part of a legal settlement. And the stage was perfectly set for these elements to make a comeback. The Craig films had been gradually reintroducing all the essential Bond components, and we've already got an evil organization. Sure, the name is different, but we can just hand-wave that away. We also can't forget that, as I discussed in the Skyfall video, that movie had a meta-narrative centered on the resurrection of classic Bond. Bringing back Bond's most famous nemesis would be a pretty logical continuation of that narrative. If Skyfall was a movie about resurrection, then perhaps we could say Spectre is a movie about necromancy, the return of a threat long believed to be dead.
Franz Oberhauser is dead and buried.
Like in Skyfall, there's a lot of dialogue here that's clearly intended to be self-referential. When we hear lines like these, for example, it's hard not to imagine the screenwriters winking at us so furiously that their eyelashes catch fire.
Welcome, James. It's been a long time. And finally, here we are. What took you so long?
So many years up there, alone, silent,
building momentum until it chose to make its mark on Earth. Can't tell you how much I've been looking forward to this. All of us here together. A reunion.
And that's all well and good, but these lines also need to make sense in the context of the movie itself, right? So that means that Blofeld and Bond need to have a long personal history, and Bond needs to be under the impression that Blofeld died a long time ago. When you combine this with Mendy's stated desire to continue exploring Bond's past, you get Foster Brothers. But make no mistake, there are other moving parts here than just the meta-narrative. For example, we could look at the name of the organization, Spectre. It's an acronym that stands for
Special Executive for Counterintelligence, Terrorism, Revenge, Extortion.
But aside from that and the fact that it sounds vaguely menacing, the name itself never really amounted to anything before. But with Spectre, the movie's thematic focus on the dead, the name suddenly takes on a whole new significance, as in literal specters, ghosts. It might sound like a small thing, and it is, but this is something I've been hammering over and over again in my videos about holism, symbolism, this idea of squeezing all the significance you can from your constraints. I like to think the creative team looked at this name and said, we could be getting more out of this. This could be doing more work. Before, the name was a Chekhov's gun that never fired, but now the writers have gone ahead and pulled the trigger. And I think this does add up to a noticeable effect on the movie itself. This idea of Spectre as an organization of the dead helps to give the movie a real spooky feel. In this shot, for instance, the way all the technicians in the background move in unison, the way they just stand there watching. I distinctly remember sitting in the theater thinking that they looked like spirits or ghosts or something. Ghosts wearing lanyards, but ghosts nonetheless. But speaking of spooky, we haven't even talked about the big opening sequence in Mexico City. It's unclear what the exact genesis of the Dia de los Muertos parade was. I never read any of those leaked Sony emails, but I've seen reporting on them that says Mexico wasn't even in the first draft of the script. It was added later, and sometime after that, the Mexican government offered the production $20 million in tax incentives if it incorporated certain changes, including the casting of a Mexican actress as Bond's companion and ensuring that the villain wouldn't be Mexican. Now, some articles also mention the parade as part of these suggestions, but it's hard to get definitive information on whether it's something that was already under consideration in some form, or if the idea came entirely from the Mexican government. In either case, it's impressive, but I think it's even more impressive if the idea came from the government. Why is it impressive? Well, I remember that when this news hit the wire while the movie was still in production, the online buzz was colored with a lot of skepticism. People were worried that parts of the film would be shoehorned in because of the financial incentives, rather than for legitimate artistic reasons. And it's a reasonable concern because that's always a possibility when you have these kinds of external constraints. But as it turns out, the end result is one of the least shoehorned sequences in the entire movie. Aside from being a fun and memorable set piece, it also has a direct link to the movie's central thematic conceit of the dead coming to life. When I think about all the constraints that went into this movie, from the Mexican tax incentives to the resolution of decades-long legal battles, the meta-narrative established in Skyfall, the desire to explore Bond's past, the mother's-father's conceit, and established parts of Bond lore such as the character of Hans Oberhauser and the name Spectre, to weave all these constraints, many of which are completely external to one another, together into a unified holistic framework, and a pretty simple one at that, that to me speaks volumes. I think that is just so cool. And it really speaks to the potential that this movie had. I think, with some changes to the screenplay and a better finale, Spectre could have been right up there with Skyfall. As it is, I would call the movie average at worst. I don't know, it seems like sometimes the public opinion on these movies is a seesaw between extremes. When a movie like Skyfall comes out, everyone's ready to say that this franchise could go on a whole nother 50 years. But then when something like Spectre comes out, then the series is decades past its prime and they should just put it out of its misery. And I think those are both overreactions. All I know is, if the Bond series has survived the likes of Diamonds Are Forever, A View to a Kill, and Die Another Day, it can sure as hell survive Spectre. At the end of my Skyfall video, I posed a question. Would Spectre be a trendsetter or a trend follower? I think it falls pretty clearly in the trend follower category. In a lot of ways, it's a direct continuation of Skyfall. It continues a lot of the same plot threads, like the tension between surveillance and human intelligence, and it also continues the idea of the self-referential meta-narrative. But it doesn't match the specific Skyfall trend I identified in my previous video, which involved rediscovering something that was left behind in the past in order to create a new optimism for the future. I don't really get that from Spectre. As for other influences, a friend pointed out to me that he saw some shades of the Avengers in this movie. The idea that individual heroes are out of fashion, and what people really want these days is to see teams of heroes. And this could explain the much expanded roles of Q, M, and Moneypenny. Watching the scenes in London especially, it does seem like they were kind of going for more of a team feel. I don't know to what degree this was a deliberate influence from cinematic universes, but all I can say is I hope the series doesn't continue too far in that direction. I don't think it's really a sustainable way to do Bond. Before I wrap this video up though, I want to speak my piece on two things. The first is that I really think Sam Smith's song gets too much hate in some circles, and I say this as someone who has a pretty strong distaste for Smith's music. In fact, when I first heard the song online before the movie came out, I didn't like it at all. But seeing it in the theater and seeing it with the animation they put together, it works, and it fits the mood of the overall movie. So I'm actually glad they chose it over the Radiohead song, and I never thought I'd say that, because I like Radiohead a fair bit. And lastly, while the Touch of Evil inspired opening sequence with the long continuous shot has understandably received a lot of attention, I haven't seen anyone talk about the train fight that seems like it could have been taken straight out of Jaws.